6.5 months after standing alone in St. Peter's Square to pray for an end to the pandemic, Pope Francis has given us a new encyclical, a pastoral letter. It's one of the highest forms of teaching from a pope, to teach us more deeply about solidarity and other core Christian values like love, kindness, and peace. Fratelli Tutti is the last in a trilogy of writings by Pope Francis. First, with Joy the Gospel, he focused on repairing the church. Next, in Laudato Si, he examines repairing the planet. And now, with Fratelli Tutti, he probes building a culture of peace and solidarity in order to work together to care for each other. Like Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti is a social encyclical, which means the Pope applies moral teachings of the Church to the social and economic challenges of the current day. Also, like Laudato Si, this encyclical is based on the life of St. Francis of Assisi when he responded to the Church and the world in his time, and it's structured using the three-part See, Judge, Act method. So let's see what Pope Francis has to say about what's happening to people and what is their true and real experience. The first chapter in the encyclical is called Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. Chapter 1 describes the really sad state of the world even before the coronavirus pandemic complicated things. What the Pope describes is very much like the documentary called Here Is My Place, about women in Brazil who live in poverty in a slum on the edge of Rio de Janeiro. You hear the women speak honestly about their lived reality, about poor education and lack of jobs, but mostly about the overwhelming and relentless social exclusion, indifference, and racism hurled at them as Black women. It is really distressing. Yet they come together to make their own hope by training each other to work as a cooperative and launch a bakery business. Francis describes how there is more than one kind of pandemic in the world today. There's inequality, xenophobia, individualistic attitudes that are indifferent to the care of others, or people who prioritize building their own wealth and well-being while others live in poverty. This leads to big problems when we expand it to the global scale. The wealthy exploit the poor, economic inequality grows, and while some places advance, the poor, elderly, and disabled go left behind. Francis needs 7 sections to describe the dark clouds over the closed world. The first he calls Without Borders, and here he's looking at the world's experience of the coronavirus. And he says, for all our hyperconnectivity, we witnessed a fragmentation that made it more difficult to resolve problems that affect us all. Anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we were already doing or to refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality. He goes on to describe shattered dreams, and here he means the loss of a shared value in democracy, freedom, justice, and unity. And he says these words have been bent and shaped to serve as tools for domination, as meaningless tags that can be used to justify any action. The third dark cloud that Francis describes in chapter 1, he calls lacking a plan for everyone. And this is his longest cloud, where he talks about a throwaway world and how universal human rights are not universal at all, and how the wealthy and powerful sow conflict and fear for their own benefit. And I pulled out 3 quotes. First, from paragraph 18. Some parts of our human family, it appears, can be readily sacrificed for the sake of others considered worthy of a carefree existence. And this is where he names vulnerable members of society, the elderly, the disabled, the unborn, minority groups. And I also want to point out the next quote from paragraph 23. Francis names women. And this quote is, similarly, the organization of societies worldwide is still far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and identical rights as men. We say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story. And I've got to admit that that makes me think about the church itself, but Francis does not turn his lens on the church in Fratelli Tutti. And then finally, looking at conflict and fear, the last quote that I chose is from paragraph 28. The loneliness, fear, and insecurity experienced by those who feel abandoned by the system creates a fertile terrain for various mafias. These flourish because they claim to be defenders of the forgotten, often by providing various forms of assistance even as they pursue their criminal interests. Of course, this makes me think of gangs, and just with what happened at our Capitol on January 6th, it makes me think about militia groups, Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, and various right-wing groups. What is it that drives people to join these groups? Uh, I think Francis is trying to scratch at that as well. There are four more dark clouds that Francis identifies in our world today, and I want to move quickly through them because I think you get the gist of it from the others that I mentioned already. Globalization, that we are forced to live closer together, but we don't value each other. You know, we don't have this shared roadmap. And the next, we have this pandemic, but we're not learning from history. And Francis says, you know, if only this may prove not to be just another tragedy of history from which we learn nothing. And then the problems at our borders go on, and Francis is faithful to remembering refugees and migrants. And then the last is self-contempt, that our globalization actually causes many people around the world to value the culture of prosperous nations over the culture of less prosperous nations, and it destroys the self-esteem of and makes people easily dominated by others. The final dark cloud identified by Francis he calls the illusion of communication. And here he critiques digital media, social media, where nothing is private and everything is judged, often harshly, falsely, and anonymously. And he really calls out the fakeness to these digital groups, that people think it's a positive form of mutual support, but actually it's just an association of individuals united against a perceived common enemy. And then if you look at paragraph 45, it really makes me think that Francis is calling out our 45th president, Donald Trump, because here he critiques the spread of fake news and false information, fomenting prejudice and hate. Pope Francis goes on in chapter 1 to answer the next question in our C section. Are we listening to the people most affected? And the answer the Pope gives is no. Pope Francis sees a globalization of indifference that makes us blind and deaf to the people most affected. Groups of people are using a strategy of ridicule, suspicion, and relentless criticism to dominate and exclude other groups. The nasty rhetoric leads to a permanent state of disagreement, confrontation, and even violence. The excluded are left alone and afraid, making them easy targets for gangs. Globalized indifference affects women, the unborn, disabled, elderly, migrants at our borders, and for many people impacted by the coronavirus. The Pope goes on to say that although we are connected globally, we don't see our brothers and sisters as our neighbors. And when these problems fester at the local level, they grow and grow to the global level with dire consequences of violent conflict, war, pointing nuclear weapons at each other, and having national policies about the death penalty. I offer 3 questions for small groups to discuss. Number 1, What trends listed by Pope Francis resonate with you? Which trend is God calling you to address in your own attitudes and actions? Number 2, in this time of political and religious division, especially on social media, how is God calling you to be an instrument of peace and unity in our world? And number 3, the pandemic revealed that no one is saved alone. What new paths of hope have been revealed to you during the pandemic?